The woman appeared through the morning mist like something conjured from the mountains themselves, her hands already working the branding iron against one of Owen Dalton's wayward calves, before he'd even cleared the tree line with his morning coffee. He stopped dead in his tracks, steam rising from the tin cup in his massive hand, and just stared at the audacious sight unfolding in his high pasture. The woman wore men's trousers rolled at the ankles, a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and her dark auburn hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense braid that hung past her shoulders. She moved with practiced efficiency, her movements sure and confident as she applied his brand to the calf's hide. Owen Dalton stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms thick, with muscle from years of wrestling timber and livestock in the unforgiving Colorado territory. His dark brown hair fell past his collar and a beard covered the sharp angles of his jaw. He'd lived alone in these mountains outside Fort Collins since 1873, building his cattle ranch with his own 2 hands and asking nothing from anybody. It was now spring of 1875, and in all that time, he'd never encountered anything quite like this. He set his coffee down on a nearby fence post and walked toward her, his long strides eating up the distance quickly. The woman must have sensed his approach because she glanced up, meeting his eyes with a directness that caught him off guard. Her eyes were the color of summer grass, bright and clear and utterly unafraid. "Morning," she said, as casually as if she'd been invited. "You had 3 calves that got through the fence down by the creek. This is the last one." Owen opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Who the hell are you?" "Lydia Foster," she replied, setting down the branding iron and wiping her hands on her trousers. "And before you get all worked up, I'm not stealing your cattle, I'm helping." "I didn't ask for help." "No," she agreed, standing up to her full height, which brought her to about his collarbone. "But you needed it. That fence has been down for at least 3 days. These calves could have wandered all the way to Denver by the time you noticed." Owen felt heat creeping up his neck, though whether from anger or embarrassment, he couldn't quite say. "I check my fences, apparently not well enough." She tilted her head, studying him with an expression that was equal parts amusement and challenge. "You going to throw me off your land, or are you going to fix that fence?" He should throw her off his land. That would be the reasonable thing to do. Instead, he found himself saying, "Where'd you learn to brand cattle?" "My father had a ranch in Wyoming, taught me everything before he died last winter." Something flickered in her eyes, there and gone so quick he almost missed it. Grief, he recognized, because he'd seen it in his own reflection often enough after losing his parents to fever years back. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Lydia shrugged, but the gesture seemed heavier than it should. "Life goes on. The ranch didn't, though. My uncle inherited it and decided a woman had no place running cattle, sold it out from under me before spring." She bent down and gathered the branding equipment with efficient movements. "So I came south, heard there was work in Fort Collins. Then I saw your fence down and figured I'd make myself useful. You always trespass on people's property, only when they look like they could use the help." She walked past him toward where he'd left his coffee, picked up the cup, and took a long sip before handing it back to him. "You've got good coffee. Most mountain men can't brew worth a damn." Owen took the cup back, still warm from her hands, and found himself fighting back something that might have been a smile. "You're the boldest woman I've ever met. I'll take that as a compliment." Lydia looked around at his property, at the sturdy cabin he'd built into the mountainside, the well-maintained barn, the corrals that showed careful craftsmanship. "You've built something good here, but you can't do it all alone. I've been managing fine. Fine isn't the same as thriving." She turned those green eyes back on him. "I'm a hard worker, I know cattle, and I can shoot straight if trouble comes calling. You give me room and board, and I'll help you run this place properly. Your cattle numbers could double in 2 years with proper management. I don't need a partner. I'm not offering partnership. I'm offering labor in exchange for a place to stay and food to eat. You can pay me wages when you can afford it." She crossed her arms. "Unless your pride is so big you'd rather struggle alone than accept help from a woman." That stung because it was partly true. Owen had spent so long being self-sufficient that the idea of accepting help felt like weakness. But he'd also spent enough time in these mountains to recognize practicality when it stared him in the face. His herd was growing beyond what one man could easily manage. Last winter he'd lost 2 cows to wolves because he couldn't be everywhere at once, and this woman clearly knew what she was doing with cattle. "The bunkhouse is empty," he heard himself say. "You'd stay there, not in the main cabin." Wouldn't have it any other way. You pull your weight or you leave. I won't carry dead weight. Fair enough. Lydia stuck out her hand. Do we have a deal? Owen looked at her outstretched hand, calloused and strong, then up at her face. She had a smattering of freckles across her nose, a small scar through her left eyebrow, and determination written in every line of her expression. Against his better judgment, he reached out and shook her hand. Her grip was firm and sure. Deal, he said, but we fix that fence first. Lydia smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to something that made his chest feel tight. Lead the way, boss. They worked side by side that entire first day, replacing broken fence posts and restringing wire. Owen found himself impressed despite his reservations. Lydia didn't shy away from the heavy work, didn't complain about the splinters or the wire cuts. She matched him pace for pace, and when she saw something that needed doing, she just did it without being asked. By the time the sun started sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, they'd repaired the fence and rounded up 2 more stray calves that had wandered even farther than the first 3. Owen's stomach was growling, and he caught himself wondering what she'd think of his cooking. I'll get supper started, he said as they walked back toward the cabin and bunkhouse. Give you time to settle into the bunkhouse. It's not fancy, but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak. Sounds like heaven after sleeping rough for the past week. Lydia paused at the fork in the path that led to the bunkhouse. Thank you, Owen, for giving me a chance. He nodded, not quite trusting his voice. There was something about the way she said his name, like she'd been saying it for years instead of having just learned it that morning. He watched her walk away, her braids swinging between her shoulder blades, and wondered what the hell he'd just gotten himself into. Inside the cabin, Owen built up the fire and started pulling out ingredients for supper. He had venison from a deer he'd shot 3 days prior, potatoes from his root cellar, and some wild onions he'd gathered. As he worked, he kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see Lydia packing up and leaving. Women didn't usually stick around his mountain. Too isolated, too rough, too much work. But something told him Lydia Foster wasn't like most women. A knock came at the door about 20 minutes later. Owen called for her to enter, and Lydia stepped inside, having changed into a clean shirt and redone her braid. She looked around the cabin with obvious interest, taking in the solid furniture he'd built, the books stacked on shelves, the bearskin rug in front of the fireplace. You built all this yourself? She asked. Every bit. Took me the better part of a year to get the cabin livable. He gestured to the table. Supper will be ready soon. I can help. You've done enough for one day. But she ignored him and moved to the counter, picking up a knife and starting to slice the potatoes with practiced ease. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft thuds of knife against cutting board. Owen found it oddly comfortable, this shared space with another person. He'd gotten so used to silence that he'd forgotten how nice it could be to have company. Why'd you come to Colorado? Lydia asked after a while. Wyoming or Montana would be closer if you were coming from the east. I like the mountains here, they feel different than other places. He stirred the venison in the pan. And Fort Collins was just getting started when I arrived. Felt like a good place to build something lasting. You ever think about getting married? Starting a family? The question caught him off guard. Not much opportunity for that up here. I go into town maybe once a month for supplies, and I'm not exactly social. You seem social enough to me. You don't count. You invited yourself. But he said it with a slight smile that took the edge off the words. Lydia laughed, a sound that filled the cabin with unexpected warmth. Fair point. But still, a man like you, with a place like this, I'd think women would be lining up. Owen snorted. Most women want civilization. Stores and churches and neighbors close by. This life isn't for everyone. It's for me, Lydia said quietly. I've never felt right in towns, too crowded, too noisy. Give me mountains and sky and hard work any day. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw the truth of it in her face. She meant what she said. The realization did something strange to his insides, made his heart beat a little faster. He turned back to the stove before she could notice. They ate supper together at his wooden table, and Owen had to admit it was nice to share a meal with someone. Lydia talked easily about her childhood in Wyoming, about learning to ride before she could properly walk, about helping her father with the ranch. She didn't mention her mother, and Owen didn't ask. Everyone had their wounds. This is good, Lydia said, gesturing to her plate. You're a better cook than I expected. What did you expect? Burned meat and raw potatoes. She grinned at him. I've known a lot of bachelors. I like eating too much to cook badly. Owen finished his plate and leaned back in his chair. Tomorrow we need to check the water sources up in the high pasture. It's about a 4-hour ride up and back. I'll be ready at dawn. She was true to her word. When Owen emerged from his cabin the next morning, Lydia was already in the barn, saddling one of his horses with the easy confidence of someone who'd been doing it her whole life. She'd braided her hair again, and in the early morning light streaming through the barn doors, the auburn strands seemed to glow like copper. "That's Rusty," Owen said, nodding at the chestnut gelding she'd chosen. "Good eye, he's the most sure-footed on mountain trails. I figured as much from looking at his build." Lydia finished tightening the cinch and turned to face him. "You ready?" They rode out as the sun was cresting the eastern peaks, painting the world in shades of pink and gold. Owen led the way up the narrow mountain trail, with Lydia following close behind. The morning air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and the lingering coolness of snow that still clung to the highest peaks even in late spring. The trail wound up through stands of aspen and pine, climbing steadily higher. Owen found himself hyper-aware of Lydia behind him, of the soft sounds she made talking to her horse, of the way she handled the challenging terrain with easy grace. When they stopped at a lookout point to rest the horses, she dismounted and walked to the edge, looking out over the vast expanse of mountains and valleys spread below them. "This is incredible," she breathed. "I've seen mountains before, but this is something else." Owen joined her at the edge, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to her. "This is why I stayed. No matter how hard it gets, I look at this and remember why it's worth it." Lydia turned to him, and for a moment they just looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Owen felt it like a physical thing, this pull toward her, and it scared him more than he wanted to admit. He'd been alone so long that wanting something, wanting someone, felt dangerous. "We should keep moving," he said, breaking the moment. "Still have a lot of ground to cover." They checked 3 different water sources that day, finding 2 running clear and strong but discovering that the third had been partially blocked by a fallen tree. Without discussion, they both dismounted and set to work clearing the debris. It took over an hour of hard labor, but eventually they had the stream flowing freely again. "Your cattle in the high pasture will appreciate that," Lydia said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "How many head do you have up here?" "About 30. I rotate them between high and low pastures depending on the season." Owen packed away the small axe he'd used to cut through some of the smaller branches. "You really do know ranching." "Told you I did." "People say a lot of things, doesn't make them true, and yet here I am, proving it." She met his eyes with that direct gaze again. "You going to trust me yet, or do I need to keep proving myself?" "Trust is earned, then I'll earn it." She mounted her horse with a fluid movement that spoke of years in the saddle. "Come on," daylight's burning. Over the following weeks, Lydia proved herself again and again. She was up before dawn every morning, working until well after dark, never complaining, never shirking. She could rope a steer, mend a fence, doctor a sick calf, and shoot a rifle with accuracy that impressed even Owen. More than that, she seemed to anticipate what needed doing before he even mentioned it. The ranch ran smoother with her there, more efficient, more productive. But it wasn't just the work that changed. The cabin felt different now, less empty. Most evenings Lydia would knock on his door after cleaning up, and they'd share supper together. She'd taken to cooking on alternate nights, and Owen had to admit she was better at it than he was. They'd talk for hours about everything and nothing, about their pasts and their hopes, about the cattle and the land and the changing seasons. Owen found himself looking forward to those evenings more than he wanted to admit. He'd catch himself watching her as she moved around his kitchen, noticing the way lamplight caught in her hair, the way she hummed softly while she cooked, the easy grace of her movements. And sometimes he'd look up to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something warm and complicated that made his pulse quick. And one evening in early June, a storm rolled in fast and fierce, the kind of mountain tempest that turned the world into a wall of rain and lightning. Lydia had been in the barn checking on a mare that was close to foaling, and Owen watched from the cabin window as she ran through the downpour toward the bunkhouse. But halfway there she changed direction and ran toward his cabin instead, bursting through the door, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. "The mare's in labor," she gasped. "It's not going well. The foal is breech." Owen was already moving, grabbing his coat and a lantern. "How long?" She's been straining for at least 20 minutes. We need to turn the foal or we'll lose them both. They ran back out into the storm together, rain lashing at them with almost physical force. Inside the barn, the mare was down on her side, sides heaving, eyes rolling with fear and pain. Owen felt his heart sink. He'd dealt with difficult births before, but breech foals were often fatal for both mother and baby. "I'll need to reach in and turn it," he said, already rolling up his sleeves. "Hold her head, keep her calm." Lydia moved to the mare's head without hesitation, kneeling in the straw and talking to the animal in a low, soothing voice. Owen worked as quickly and carefully as he could, his hands following the unnatural angles of the foal's legs, trying to maneuver the tiny body into the right position. The mare groaned and thrashed, but Lydia held her steady, never stopping that low stream of comforting words. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Owen's arms ached, his back screamed in protest from the awkward position, but he didn't stop. Finally, he felt the foal shift, its body rotating into the proper position for birth. He pulled his arms back and nodded to Lydia. "Got it. She should be able to push now." And she did. Within 15 minutes, a wet, gangly foal slid out into the straw, and the mare immediately struggled to her feet, turning to sniff and nuzzle her baby. The foal, after a moment of stillness that stopped Owen's heart, shook its head and began trying to stand on impossibly long legs. "We did it," Lydia breathed, and Owen looked over to see tears mixing with the rain on her face. "We actually did it." The relief and joy on her face was so pure, so beautiful, that Owen acted without thinking. He crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She stiffened for just a second, then melted into him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her face pressed against his shoulder. They stayed like that for a long moment, both soaked and exhausted, and covered in barn muck, while the storm raged outside and new life wobbled on uncertain legs beside them. Owen breathed in the scent of her, rain and earth, and something uniquely Lydia, and felt something crack open inside his chest, something he'd kept locked away for so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. When they finally pulled apart, Lydia looked up at him with wide eyes. Her lips were slightly parted, and Owen found his gaze drawn to them, found himself leaning down almost against his will. But at the last second, he stopped himself, pulled back, cleared his throat. "We should get cleaned up," he said, his voice rough. "You'll catch your death in those wet clothes." Something flickered in her eyes, disappointment maybe, but she nodded. "Right, of course." They walked back to the cabin together, the storm having diminished to a steady rain. At the fork in the path, Lydia paused. "Owen? Yeah? Thank you. For tonight. For everything. You're the one who noticed the mare was in trouble. We make a good team." She smiled, small and tentative. "Don't we?" "Yeah," he admitted, because it was true. "We do." She nodded and turned toward the bunkhouse, and Owen watched her go with a strange ache in his chest. Inside the cabin, he built up the fire and changed into dry clothes. But he couldn't stop thinking about how she'd felt in his arms, how right it had seemed, how much he'd wanted to kiss her. He'd been alone so long. It had been safer that way, easier, after losing his parents and watching other people he cared about drift in and out of his life. But Lydia was different. She'd dug herself into his life like she belonged there, and the terrifying thing was how much he wanted her to stay. The next morning, things felt different between them. Not bad different, but charged somehow, like the air before a lightning strike. They were both careful not to touch, careful to maintain a proper distance, but Owen caught Lydia watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, and he knew she caught him doing the same. They rode out to check the fence lines that day, and Owen tried to focus on the work, on the practical matters of running a ranch, but his awareness of Lydia was like a constant hum beneath everything else, making it hard to think straight. "Something wrong?" she asked as they were mending a weak spot in the fence. "You've been quiet all morning." "Just thinking about you," he almost said. "About how you've turned my whole life upside down in just a few weeks. About how I don't remember what it felt like before you were here." But he couldn't say any of that, so he just shook his head. "Nothing important." Lydia set down the wire cutters and looked at him with those penetrating green eyes. "You're a terrible liar. Maybe I just don't want to talk about it. Or maybe you're scared to." That hit too close to home. Owen felt heat crawl up his neck, felt his jaw tighten. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" She took a step closer. "I've been watching you, Owen. The way you hold back, the way you keep everyone at arm's length. But last night in the barn, for just a moment you let me in, and it scared you. You're imagining things, am I?" Another step closer. "Because I could have sworn you were about to kiss me." Owen's heart hammered against his ribs. Lydia, tell me I'm wrong. Her voice was soft now, challenging. Tell me you don't feel this thing between us. He couldn't. God help him. He couldn't lie to her, not when she was looking at him like that, not when the truth was burning a hole through his chest. I feel it, he admitted roughly. But that doesn't mean acting on it is a good idea. Why not? Because you work for me. Because you just got here. Because I don't know how to do this and I don't want to mess it up. Lydia's expression softened. You think I know how to do this any better? I've never felt like this before, either, but I know running from it isn't the answer. I'm not running, aren't you? She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. He knew she could feel how hard it was beating. I came here with nothing. No home, no family, no plan beyond surviving another day. And then I found you, found this place, and for the first time since my father died, I felt like maybe I could have a future. Maybe I could have a home again. Maybe I could have more. Owen covered her hand with his, pressing it harder against his chest. I'm not an easy man. I'm rough around the edges, set in my ways. Living up here isn't like living in town. It's isolated and hard and lonely. It doesn't have to be lonely. Not anymore. She moved even closer, until there were only inches between them. I'm not asking for promises, Owen. I'm just asking you not to push me away. He stared down at her, at this impossible woman who'd walked into his life like she owned it, who'd seen what needed doing, and just done it, who'd somehow slipped past every defense he'd built around his heart, and he realized he didn't want to push her away. He wanted to pull her closer, wanted to keep her here always, wanted things he hadn't let himself want in years. I don't want to push you away, he said quietly. That's what scares me. Lydia smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. This time when he leaned down, he didn't stop. His lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, like neither of them quite believed this was happening. But then Lydia made a small sound in the back of her throat and rose up on her toes, her free hand sliding up to tangle in his hair, and the kiss deepened into something that made Owen's head spin. She tasted like the coffee they'd shared that morning, like the mint leaves she sometimes chewed. She fit against him perfectly, like she'd been made to be there. And when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Owen rested his forehead against hers and felt something settle in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to contentment. Well, Lydia said breathlessly, that was worth waiting for. Owen laughed, surprised by the sound coming from his own throat. We should probably finish this fence, probably. But neither of them moved. They stood there in the mountain sunshine, wrapped around each other, and Owen thought that maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to stop being alone. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and stolen moments. They maintained propriety. Lydia still sleeping in the bunkhouse, still keeping things professional during the day, but evenings became something special. After supper, they'd sit on the porch together as twilight painted the mountains purple, talking and laughing and sometimes just existing in comfortable silence. And there were more kisses, slow and sweet, Owen discovering all the ways Lydia sighed and smiled against his lips. In early July, Owen made the trip into Fort Collins for supplies. And for the first time in all his years on the mountain, he didn't go alone. Lydia rode beside him on Rusty, her face bright with curiosity as they approached the small but growing town. Fort Collins had been established as a military outpost just 12 years earlier, and the town that had grown up around it was still raw and new, but it was thriving, with false-fronted buildings lining the main street, wagons rolling past, and people going about their business with the purposeful energy of those building something from nothing. Owen guided them to the general store, where a portly man named Herman greeted him with surprise. Owen Dalton! Didn't expect to see you for another few weeks, and with a companion, no less. Herman, this is Lydia Foster. She's helping me with the ranch. Owen felt oddly protective introducing her, aware of how people might judge a woman living alone on a mountain with a man, but Herman just smiled warmly. Pleased to meet you, Miss Foster. Any friend of Owen's is welcome here. He leaned in conspiratorially. And between you and me, it's about time someone convinced this hermit to rejoin civilization now and then. Lydia laughed. He's not so bad once you get past the gruff exterior. They spent a pleasant hour in town, buying supplies and introducing Lydia to the few people Owen knew well enough to call friends. He noticed the way people looked at them, speculation in their eyes, but no one said anything improper, and when they finally headed back up the mountain, their horses loaded with supplies, Owen felt lighter than he had in years. They liked you, he said as they rode. The town folks, They like you too. They just wish you'd come around more often. Lydia glanced at him. Why don't you? Never saw the point. I have everything I need on the mountain. Do you, though? It wasn't a challenge, just a question. People need people, Owen. Even mountain men. I have you now. The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than he'd intended. Lydia reined in her horse and Owen stopped beside her. They were high up on the trail with a view that stretched for miles in every direction. Do you? Lydia asked quietly. Have me, I mean, because we've been dancing around this for weeks now and I need to know where I stand. Owen's heart lodged in his throat. This was it, the moment where he either opened up completely or lost her. And the thought of losing her was unbearable. I want you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Not just to help with the ranch, not just for company. I want you in my life, in every way. I want to wake up with you beside me and fall asleep holding you. I want to build something with you, not just cattle herds, but a future, a family. He dismounted and walked to her horse, looking up at her. I know it's fast, and I know I'm not smooth with words. But Lydia, you've become the best part of my days. If you'll have me, rough edges and all, I'm yours. Lydia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She slid down from her horse and into his arms, and he caught her easily, holding her tight. Yes, she whispered against his neck. Yes to all of it. I'm yours, Owen. I have been since that first morning. He kissed her there on the mountain trail, with the wind whipping around them and the horses standing patiently nearby. It was a kiss full of promise, of commitment, of a future neither of them had dared to dream of before they found each other. When they got back to the ranch that evening, Lydia didn't go to the bunkhouse. She moved her few belongings into the cabin, into Owen's room, into his life properly and completely. That night they lay together in his big bed, Lydia's head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her, and talked about everything they wanted to build together. We should expand the herd, Lydia said, tracing idle patterns on his chest. Maybe add some sheep too. Diversify our income. Our income? Owen felt his heart warm at the word. Well, I'm not working for room and board anymore, am I? I'm your partner now. In every sense. Does that mean you want to make this official? Lydia propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with amusement. Owen Dalton, was that a proposal? He grinned, feeling freer than he'd ever felt. I'm a simple man. I don't know fancy words or romantic speeches. But I love you, Lydia Foster. And I want you to be my wife. Then I'm going to be your wife. She kissed him softly. Because I love you too, your gruffness and your strength and your good heart. All of it. They were married in Fort Collins 2 weeks later, with Herman as witness and the local pastor performing the ceremony in the small church. Lydia wore a simple dress in deep green that matched her eyes, and Owen wore his best shirt and pants, his hair trimmed and beard neatly groomed for the occasion. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Owen kissed her like he'd never let her go. The ride back to the ranch felt different now. This wasn't just his mountain anymore. It was theirs. Their home, their future, their life to build together. And as they crested the final ridge and saw the cabin and barn spread out below them, Lydia reached over and squeezed his hand. Home, she said simply. Home, Owen agreed. Life fell into a new rhythm after that. Lydia was no longer just helping run the ranch. She was running it alongside him, making decisions, implementing improvements, pushing them both to be better. The herd did expand, and they did add sheep, and by the following spring they were profitable enough to hire occasional help for the heavy work. But it was the small moments that Owen treasured most. Waking up with Lydia warm and soft beside him, watching her ride out across their land with the sun at her back, the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, how she'd stand between his arms while he taught her to play the harmonica he'd bought in town. The quiet evenings when they'd simply sit together, her doing needlework while he carved, comfortable in their shared silence. In late autumn, Lydia started feeling poorly in the mornings, and Owen felt his heart leap with hope and fear. When the doctor in Fort Collins confirmed what they'd suspected, that Lydia was carrying their first child, Owen lifted her right off her feet and spun her around despite her protests. "Put me down, you crazy man," she laughed. "You'll make me dizzy." "We're having a baby," he said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "Lydia, we're going to be parents, I know." She placed his big hand on her still flat stomach. "Our son or daughter, growing right here." Owen felt something shift in his chest, an expansion of love so fierce it almost hurt. He'd thought he couldn't love Lydia more than he already did, but the knowledge that she carried their child made his heart feel too big for his ribs. Winter came, and Owen was fiercely protective of Lydia, trying to keep her from the heavier work. She tolerated it with good humor for the most part, though she insisted on still doing her share. They spent the long winter evenings planning the nursery, talking about names, imagining the future. "If it's a boy, I want to name him after your father," Lydia said one night as snow fell softly outside the windows. "And if it's a girl, after my mother, Rose." She smiled softly. "I don't talk about her much, but she was a good woman, strong and kind. I'd like our daughter to carry her name." Owen kissed her temple. "Rose Dalton, that's beautiful." As winter gave way to spring, Lydia's belly grew round and full. She moved slower now, but never stopped moving. Never stopped working. Owen had never seen anything more beautiful than his wife, heavy with their child, glowing with health and happiness, despite the obvious discomfort. In early May, as the mountains exploded with wildflowers and new life, Lydia woke Owen in the middle of the night with a hand on his shoulder. "It's time," she said calmly. "The baby's coming." Owen's calm immediately evaporated. He stumbled out of bed, pulling on clothes with shaking hands. "I'll ride for the doctor, Owen." Lydia's voice stopped him. "There isn't time. Fort Collins is 3 hours away. This baby isn't waiting that long. Then I'll get the midwife from the Johnson Ranch." "That's still an hour each way," she grimaced as a contraction hit. "You're going to have to do this." Terror unlike anything Owen had ever felt flooded through him. "Lydia, I can't. I'm not qualified. I don't know what to do." "Yes, you do." She took his hand, squeezing it through the contraction. "You've delivered dozens of calves, several foals. The principle is the same. That's completely different. Not as different as you think." Another contraction, harder this time. "Please, Owen, I need you. Our baby needs you." So Owen buried his fear and did what needed to be done. He got water heating, gathered clean linens, and helped Lydia through each contraction with a steady stream of encouragement, even though his insides were churning with terror. Hours passed in a blur of pain and effort, and Owen had never felt so helpless, so desperate to take her suffering onto himself. But Lydia was strong, stronger than he could have imagined. She worked with her body, breathing through the pain, gripping his hands hard enough to bruise. And finally, as dawn light began creeping through the windows, their baby slid into Owen's waiting hands. "It's a boy," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Lydia, we have a son." The baby let out a strong, healthy cry, and Owen quickly cleaned him and wrapped him in a soft blanket before placing him in Lydia's waiting arms. She looked up at Owen with tears streaming down her face, exhausted but radiant. "He's perfect," she whispered. "Owen, he's absolutely perfect." Owen looked down at his wife and son, at this tiny person they'd created together, and felt his entire world shift on its axis. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and when he opened his eyes, they were blue like Owen's. His tiny hand gripped Owen's finger with surprising strength. "Hello, Thomas," Owen said softly, using his father's name. "Welcome to the world, son." The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and steep learning curves. Owen discovered that being responsible for a tiny human was far more terrifying than anything he'd faced in the wilderness, but he also discovered a capacity for love he'd never known he possessed. Watching Lydia nurse their son, seeing her tired but happy face as she rocked Thomas to sleep, witnessing the tiny baby's first real smile, it all filled him with a joy so profound he sometimes had to step outside just to breathe through it. Thomas grew strong and healthy, and as he did, the ranch continued to thrive. By the time Thomas was walking, they'd expanded their operation enough to build a proper bunkhouse for the 2 ranch hands they'd hired. Lydia managed the books and the household while also working alongside Owen and the hands when needed. She was in her element, thriving in a way that made Owen's heart swell with pride. When Thomas was 2, Lydia became pregnant again, and Owen was better prepared this time. He made sure the doctor in Fort Collins knew to be ready, and when their second child came, he was able to focus on supporting Lydia while the doctor handled the medical aspects. This time they had a daughter, and they named her Rose as planned. Rose looked like her mother, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to see everything. She was quieter than Thomas, but just as strong-willed, and watching his 2 children grow filled Owen with a contentment he'd never imagined possible. The years rolled by, marked by the changing seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. Thomas learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk, and Rose wasn't far behind. Both children grew up working alongside their parents, learning the land and the cattle, developing the same deep connection to the mountains that Owen felt. When Thomas was 8 and Rose was 6, they hired a teacher to come up from Fort Collins 3 times a week to educate the children. Lydia had insisted on it, wanting their children to have opportunities beyond just ranching. Owen had agreed, though privately he hoped at least one of them would want to continue what they'd built. One evening, sitting on the porch with Lydia while the children played in the yard, Owen reflected on how different his life was from what he'd expected. "You know," he said, pulling Lydia closer against his side, "I used to think I was happy alone, convinced myself I didn't need anyone, and now?" Lydia tilted her head to look up at him. "Now I can't imagine a single day without you, without all of you." He watched Thomas teach Rose how to throw a rope. "You changed everything, Lydia. That first morning when I found you branding my cattle, I was annoyed. Thought you were the most audacious woman I'd ever met." "I was audacious," she smiled. "But I saw what you had built, and I saw that you were struggling to maintain it alone. I knew I could help, and maybe, somewhere deep down, I knew I'd found where I was meant to be." "You ever regret it, the life we have here? It's isolated, hard work, not for a single second." She turned in his arms to face him fully. "Every day with you is better than the best day of my old life. You gave me a home when I had nothing. You gave me partnership, respect, love. You gave me children and a purpose. How could I possibly regret any of that?" Owen kissed her then, soft and sweet, still amazed after all these years that she was his, that this life was real. "Papa," Rose came running up to the porch. "Thomas says I throw like a girl." "You are a girl," Owen pointed out reasonably. "But he meant it mean." Lydia hid a smile behind her hand as Owen tried to navigate this particular parenting challenge. Eventually he settled on explaining that girls could do anything boys could do, sometimes better, and pointing out that Rose's mother was the best ranch hand he'd ever worked with. That night, after the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet except for the usual night sounds, Owen lay in bed with Lydia curled against his side. They'd been married for nearly 9 years now, and the passion between them had only deepened with time. She was his partner in every sense, the other half of himself. "I love you," he said into the darkness. "I know I don't say it enough. You show it every day." Lydia's hand found his over the blanket. "In the way you look at me, the way you support my ideas, the way you are with our children. I feel loved every single day, Owen. Good, because you are. More than I have words to express." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Owen thought that maybe this was what happiness really meant. Not grand gestures or dramatic moments, but this quiet contentment, this bone-deep certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly who he was supposed to be with. The next decade passed in a blur of growth and change. Fort Collins grew from a small frontier town into a proper city. The railroad came through, bringing more settlers and more opportunities. Their ranch expanded along with the region, and by the time Thomas was 18 and Rose 16, the Dalton Ranch was one of the most successful operations in northern Colorado. Thomas had grown into a strapping young man, as tall as Owen and nearly as broad through the shoulders. He had Owen's love for the land and Lydia's head for business, and Owen knew the ranch would be in good hands when he eventually passed it on. Rose, meanwhile, had surprised them by developing a passion for horses. She trained them with a patience and intuition that was remarkable, and several ranchers in the area now brought their difficult horses to her. "She has a gift," Lydia said one day, watching Rose work with a particularly skittish mare. "Just like someone else I know had the gift of seeing what needed to be done and doing it." Owen pulled his wife close, still marveling that she fit against him as perfectly now as she had 20 years ago. "Remember when you just showed up and started branding my cattle? Best decision I ever made." Lydia turned in his arms. "You know what tomorrow is? Tuesday?" She swatted his chest playfully. "It's 20 years since the day we met. 20 years since I saw a broken fence and decided to fix it. 20 years since you fixed a lot more than just my fence." Owen kissed her forehead. "You fixed me, Lydia. Made me whole in ways I didn't even know I was broken." "We fixed each other," she corrected. "I was lost and grieving and alone. You gave me purpose and home and love. We built this together." That evening, they had a celebration dinner with Thomas and Rose. The children gave them a beautiful handmade picture frame containing a sketch of the ranch, drawn by a traveling artist who'd passed through the previous summer. Owen and Lydia gave each other the gift they always did on their anniversary, simple bands of metal they'd had made by the Fort Collins blacksmith when they were first married. Worn smooth now by 20 years of wear, after dinner, Thomas cleared his throat. "I have some news. Mary Henderson has agreed to marry me." Lydia gasped with delight while Owen felt his heart clench. Mary was a good girl, daughter of the banker in Fort Collins, and he'd seen the way his son looked at her. But the knowledge that Thomas was grown enough to marry, to start his own family, made Owen feel the passage of time in a profound way. That's wonderful, he managed. When next spring? And Papa, I was hoping we could start building a house for us on the east section near the creek. I want to stay here, work the ranch with you, build it up even more. The relief Owen felt was overwhelming. Nothing would make me happier, son. Rose spoke up then, her voice tentative. I have news too. Jonathan Myers has asked me to move to Denver with him. He wants to start a horse breeding operation there, and he wants me to be his partner. This time, Owen's heart did more than clench. It nearly stopped. Denver, I know it's far, and I know you need me here, but Papa, this is my dream, to breed and train horses on a larger scale. Jonathan has the capital and the connections, and I have the expertise. She looked between her parents with pleading eyes. Please don't be angry. Owen looked at his daughter, at this brave, capable young woman who had her mother's fire and his love for independence. He wanted to say no, wanted to keep her close where he could protect her, but he remembered being young and ambitious, remembered building something of his own. How could he deny her the same opportunity? I'm not angry, he said, though his voice was rough with emotion. I'm proud. You've found your passion and you're brave enough to pursue it. That's all I've ever wanted for you. Rose flew around the table and hugged him tight. Thank you, Papa. Thank you for understanding. That night, lying in bed with Lydia, Owen felt the bittersweet ache of watching his children grow up and away. They're leaving us, he said quietly. Thomas is staying, but Rose is going, and even Thomas won't need us the way he used to. He'll have Mary. Lydia rolled over to face him, her hand cupping his bearded cheek. This is what we raised them for, Owen. To be strong and capable and independent, to find their own paths. We haven't lost them. We've succeeded in preparing them for the world. I know. Doesn't make it easier. No, she agreed, but think of it this way. We'll have grandchildren before long. And we'll have this ranch, still thriving, still growing, and most importantly, we'll have each other, just like we started. Owen pulled her close, breathing in her familiar scent. Just like we started, he echoed, except this time I'm not foolish enough to push you away. Good, because I'm still not leaving. The next year brought changes, both joyful and bittersweet. Rose moved to Denver with Jonathan, and though Owen missed her terribly, the letters she sent were full of excitement about her new life. Thomas married Mary in a beautiful ceremony at the Fort Collins Church, and by the following winter they were expecting their first child. Owen was 52 years old when his first grandchild was born, a healthy baby boy that Thomas and Mary named Owen Jr. Holding that tiny baby, seeing his son experience the same overwhelming love Owen had felt when Thomas was born, created a sense of continuity that was deeply satisfying. Lydia, at 50, was still as beautiful to Owen as she'd been at 30. Her auburn hair now had threads of silver running through it, and there were laugh lines around her eyes and mouth. But she moved with the same confidence, spoke with the same directness, loved with the same fierce devotion. They settled into a new rhythm, working the ranch but gradually allowing Thomas and Mary to take over more of the daily operations. Owen found he didn't mind stepping back as much as he'd feared. He'd built something lasting, something that would continue after he was gone, and he had more time to spend with Lydia, to simply enjoy the life they'd created. On a bright morning in late spring, when Owen was 60 and Lydia was 58, they rode up to the high pasture where they'd cleared the blocked stream all those years ago. It had become a tradition of sorts, this annual ride to their special places on the mountain. They dismounted at the lookout point where Owen had first admitted how he felt about her, and stood at the edge, looking out over the vast expanse of land and sky. The ranch spread out below them, larger and more prosperous than Owen had ever dreamed possible. Remember the first time we stood here? Lydia asked, leaning back against him. I was terrified, Owen admitted, of how much I already felt for you, of how much I wanted you to stay. I knew that day that I'd found home. Not just the ranch, but you. She turned in his arms. Thank you for taking a chance on the audacious woman who showed up uninvited and started branding your cattle. Owen laughed, the sound echoing across the mountains. Best thing that ever happened to me. You literally worked your way into my life and refused to leave, and you let me. Despite all your protests and your fear, you let me in. She reached up and traced the lines of his face, now weathered and lined but still strong. We built something good, didn't we? We built something extraordinary. Owen kissed her softly. A partnership, a family, a legacy, and we did it together, every step of the way. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the play of light and shadow across their mountains. Below them the ranch hummed with activity. Thomas worked in the corrals, teaching young Owen Jr. how to handle a rope. Mary worked in the garden she'd planted. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main cabin, where they'd recently added on more rooms. Rose wrote regularly from Denver, where her horse breeding operation was thriving. She'd married Jonathan the previous year, and her letters hinted at a baby on the way. The thought of another grandchild filled Owen with quiet joy. "We should head back," Lydia said eventually. "Mary's making that roast you love for supper." But Owen held her a moment longer, not quite ready to break this perfect moment. "I love you, Lydia Dalton. Today, tomorrow, and whatever comes after. You're the best part of every day I've lived since you walked into my life. I love you too, Owen. Always have, always will." They rode back down the mountain together, the same way they'd ridden up it countless times over the past 30 years. Their horses knew the trail by heart, and they rode side by side, hands occasionally brushing, comfortable in their long familiarity. At the church, Thomas greeted them with young Owen Jr. toddling at his side. The little boy, barely 3 years old, ran to Owen with his arms up. "Grandpa, I roped the post all by myself." Owen scooped him up, marveling at how this tiny person carried his name and his legacy. "Did you now? That's my boy." That evening, they all gathered around the expanded dining table, 3 generations of Dalton sharing a meal and stories and laughter. Owen looked around at the faces he loved, at the life that had grown from a chance encounter and a woman brave enough to fix a stranger's fence, and felt a contentment so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Lydia caught his eye from across the table and smiled, that same direct, knowing smile she'd given him that first morning. In that smile, Owen saw everything they'd been, everything they were, and everything they would be. Whatever time they had left, they would face it together, just as they always had. As the evening wound down and Thomas took his sleepy son home, Owen and Lydia sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The mountains stood eternal around them, the same mountains that had witnessed their beginning and would outlast their ending. "No regrets?" Owen asked, though he knew the answer. "Not a single one." Lydia laced her fingers through his. "You? Only that I wasted those first few weeks trying to keep my distance. You were scared. It's understandable. Maybe. But I should have known better. From the moment you started branding my cattle without asking, I should have known you weren't the kind of woman who could be kept at a distance." Lydia laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet evening. "I saw what I wanted and I went after it. I make no apologies for that." "Good. Because that's one of the things I love most about you, your absolute certainty, your refusal to let obstacles stop you." He raised her hand to his lips. "You saved me, Lydia, from loneliness, from a half-lived life. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything." She rested her head on his shoulder. "And we built something that will last long after we're gone. Look at what we created. Not just the ranch, but our family, our legacy. Thomas will pass it on to Owen Jr., and he'll pass it to his children. We'll live on through them." As the last light faded from the sky and the mountain air grew cool, they sat together in the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd spent a lifetime learning each other. And Owen knew, with a certainty as solid as the mountains around them, that he was the luckiest man alive. Because 30 years ago, a woman with auburn hair and green eyes had seen a broken fence and decided to fix it, and in fixing that fence, she'd fixed everything else too. The years continued to roll by with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing. Rose returned from Denver for visits, bringing her husband Jonathan and eventually their 2 children. The Dalton Ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's management, expanding and adapting to the changing times while maintaining the core values Owen and Lydia had built it on. Owen and Lydia grew older together, their hair turning silver, their movements becoming slower but no less purposeful. They took shorter rides now, content to watch their grandchildren race across the meadows where they'd once worked from dawn to dusk. But the connection between them never weakened. If anything, it deepened with each passing year, burnished by time and shared experience into something unbreakable. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Thomas raised a toast. "To my parents, who showed me what love really looks like. Not the easy kind, but the kind that works, that builds, that lasts. Papa, you always said Mama wasn't leaving from the day she started branding your cattle. Turns out you were right." Everyone laughed, and Owen pulled Lydia close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I never made," he said. "She decided for both of us." "Someone had to," Lydia replied, her eyes twinkling. "You were too stubborn to admit you needed help. I needed you. There's a difference." As the celebration continued around them, Owen found himself reflecting on the incredible journey of their life together. From that morning when he'd found her working his cattle, through building a life and a family, through all the joys and sorrows that had marked their years. She'd been his partner through everything, matching him stride for stride, never backing down, never giving up. That night, in the bedroom they'd shared for 4 decades, Owen helped Lydia prepare for bed with the gentle care born of long practice and deep love. They moved around each other in the familiar dance of old lovers, anticipating needs, offering support without being asked. "Thank you," Owen said as they settled into bed, Lydia's head finding its usual spot on his shoulder. "For what?" "For being exactly who you are, for seeing what needed to be done and doing it, even when that meant forcing your way into the life of a stubborn mountain man who didn't know how much he needed you." Lydia tilted her head up to kiss his jaw. "You would have figured it out eventually, maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to. I'm glad you were brave enough for both of us." They fell asleep like that, the same way they had for 40 years. And Owen's last thought before sleep took him was that he hoped for 40 more. But even if they didn't have that long, he'd lived a lifetime of happiness in the years they'd been given. The morning sun rose over the mountains, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber. Below the master bedroom window, the ranch stirred to life. Thomas and Mary's voices drifted up as they started their day. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed and horses whinnied. The ranch that had started with one man's solitary vision and one woman's determination to help had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. But it all traced back to that one morning, when Owen Dalton had found a stranger branding his cattle, and Lydia Foster had looked him in the eye and refused to be intimidated. When she'd seen what he'd built and decided she could help make it better, when she'd chosen to stay, and he'd finally been wise enough to let her. It was a love story written in fence posts and cattle brands, in shared labor and mutual respect, in the quiet accumulation of days spent side by side. It wasn't the kind of romance found in storybooks, with grand declarations and dramatic gestures. It was something better, something real. It was partnership in its truest form, 2 people building a life together one day at a time, one decision at a time, one shared moment at a time. And as Owen pulled Lydia closer in his sleep, his arms instinctively tightening around her even in unconsciousness, the mountains stood witness to a love that had proved as enduring as the stone peaks themselves. A love that had started with a woman audacious enough to brand a stranger's cattle, and a man wise enough to recognize that she was exactly what he needed, even if he'd been too stubborn to admit it at first. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, passed down through generations. But it would always carry the mark of its founders, Owen and Lydia Dalton, who proved that the strongest foundations are built by 2 people working together, and that sometimes the best things in life are the ones that arrive uninvited and refuse to leave.